The chamber of the Galactic Council was built to humble those who entered it, a vast ring of ascending platforms carved from dark crystal and lit by the cold glow of distant stars, where dozens of species that ruled thousands of worlds gathered to decide the fate of civilizations. And on the cycled name of Earth was spoken with open contempt, as the holographic image of a small blue planet rotated slowly above the center well, its oceans and clouds beautiful yet, to the counselors, meaningless. And the voice of High Speaker Verex of the Trellic Dominion carried through the air with practiced authority, as he declared that humanity had failed to comply with the Council's demands for resource submission and military limitation, labeling them an unpredictable and potentially dangerous species whose rapid technological growth posed a long-term risk to galactic stability. And around him, representatives of ancient empires murmured in agreement, some amused, some irritated, many simply bored. Because to them humans were newcomers, loud and stubborn, but still confined to a single star system, a minor presence that dared to question orders given by powers that had ruled the stars for millennia. And when the vote was called, it passed with overwhelming support, a formal decree that humanity would be contained and, if necessary, erased, their shipyards dismantled, their orbital defenses destroyed, their governments forced into submission, and in the quiet hall of the decision, felt final and effortless, like swatting an insect that had grown too noisy, yet far from that chamber. On the edge of the Sol system, Captain Daniel Carter stood on the bridge of the human battleship, resolute, watching data streams flow across the tactical displays, his face calm but his jaw set as a message from the Council arrived, a message that was not a negotiation, but an ultimatum, ordering Earth to surrender its fleet and accept permanent oversight. And when the transmission ended, he turned to his crew and said in a steady voice that the Council had chosen its path, and they would soon learn what that choice meant. While on Earth itself in a fortified complex beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Laura Bennett listened to the same words and felt a familiar cold settle in her chest, the kind that came before war, as analysts and officers around her reviewed intelligence reports showing the movement of foreign fleets, vast armadas assembling at distant jump points, confident in their numbers and in their long history of crushing resistance. And she thought of the counselors who had never seen a human city burn, never heard a human colony scream for help across the void, never studied the wars that had shaped her species, wars fought not for conquest but for survival, wars that had taught humanity how to adapt, how to innovate, how to endure losses and strike back harder. And she knew that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake by assuming that a young civilization could not also be a dangerous one, as in another sector ambassador Richard Hale stood before the human diplomatic staff and told them plainly that the era of pleading was over, that the Council had chosen force, and that humanity would answer in a language the galaxy understood, while across human space shipyards that had once built trade vessels and exploration craft shifted to full wartime production. Ancient contingency plans were activated, and fleets that had been kept hidden in deep space began to move, their commanders carrying sealed orders written years before by strategists who had always believed that one day the great powers would try to put humanity in its place. And as the alien armadas advanced, their leaders confident and dismissive, the first skirmishes broke out on the fringes, small human patrols engaging larger enemy formations with tactics that seemed reckless, drawing them into traps, exploiting weaknesses in shield harmonics, using electronic warfare that disrupted targeting systems long thought invulnerable, and each minor clash ended with unexpected losses for the attackers, losses that were explained away as anomalies or the result of overconfidence, yet the pattern repeated. And reports began to reach the Council that human forces were not collapsing as predicted, that instead they were fighting with coordination and precision that suggested a depth of preparation no one had credited them with. And still the Council pressed forward, ordering the main fleets to converge on Sol to deliver a decisive blow, believing that once Earth itself was threatened, the humans would finally submit, unaware that by forcing the conflict into humanity's home system, they were stepping into a defense network built layer upon layer, minefields hidden in gravitational shadows, autonomous weapon platforms camouflaged among asteroids, and squadrons of fast attack ships trained for hit-and-run warfare in terrain no outsider had ever mapped in detail. And when the first wave of alien vessels crossed the heliopause, they were met not by panic, but by a calm, methodical response. Human commanders executing plans that had been refined in simulations for decades, sacrificing nothing unnecessarily, striking supply ships and command vessels, isolating formations and tearing them apart piece by piece. While back in the council chamber, confusion replaced arrogance as projections showed casualty figures climbing far beyond expectations. And some counselors began to question whether the humans had been underestimated, only to be silenced by others who insisted that these were merely delaying actions, that once the full might of the armada arrived, the resistance would crumble. Yet even as they spoke, the second and third waves suffered similar fates, and the narrative of an easy victory began to unravel, because humanity was not fighting like a cornered prey species, but like a power that had been waiting, that had accepted long ago that one day the galaxy would test it and had prepared accordingly. And as the war expanded, human forces launched counterstrikes beyond Sol, hitting forward bases and shipyards that the Council had considered secure, revealing intelligence capabilities that penetrated encrypted networks and supply routes. And with each success, the message became clearer that the vote to erase humanity had not cowed them but unified them, that their industries, their militaries, and their populations were aligned with a single purpose: to survive and to make sure that those who threatened their existence paid a cost so high it would be remembered for generations. And in the early days of the conflict, before the great battles that would later be studied in every war academy, the first realization began to dawn among the alien commanders, a quiet, unsettling thought that spread from bridge to bridge and from council chamber to council chamber, that the species they had dismissed as primitive and insignificant was proving to be disciplined, adaptable, and relentless, and that in voting to erase humanity, they might have done something far worse than start another small war. They might have awakened a civilization that had been forged by struggle and that now, with its back against the wall, was ready to show the galaxy exactly what it was capable of doing. As the first major engagements rippled outward from the Sol system, the commanders of the invading armadas began to sense that the conflict was unfolding in ways their doctrines had not prepared them for, because the humans did not form rigid battle lines or seek glorious decisive clashes. Instead, they moved like a living network, striking at communication nodes, fuel depots, and repair yards, always appearing where the enemy least expected them, and vanishing before overwhelming force could be brought to bear. And in the war rooms of the Trellic Dominion and its allied empires, analysts struggled to explain how a species with such a short history of interstellar travel could coordinate operations across multiple sectors with such speed and accuracy, while on a forward command ship of the Vascari Coalition, Fleet Lord Kether watched a tactical display as 3 of his carrier groups were forced to withdraw after their escort screens were shredded by human missile salvos that curved through space with uncanny precision, guided by algorithms that adapted in real time to countermeasures. And he found himself thinking of the briefings that had dismissed human technology as crude, powerful in raw output perhaps, but unsophisticated. And he realized now that those assessments had been based on incomplete data and dangerous assumptions, because the humans had not revealed their most advanced systems in trade or diplomacy. They had kept them hidden, developed in secrecy, refined, through relentless testing, and now deployed with cold efficiency. And as Kether ordered a regrouping, he received reports of a human task force that had bypassed its outer defenses entirely by using micro-jumps through unstable gravity wells, a maneuver long considered too risky for large formations, yet the humans had executed with precision, emerging inside the defensive perimeter of a key logistics hub and destroying it before reinforcements would respond, and the loss sent shockwaves through the supply network supporting the invasion, forcing delays and exposing other convoys to similar attacks. While on Earth, in the subterranean command center, Admiral Bennett and her staff monitored the unfolding campaign with focused intensity, aware that every success bought time but also escalated the enemy's determination, and she spoke often of restraint, not in the sense of holding back, but in choosing targets that would cripple the invaders' ability to sustain the war rather than chasing dramatic victories. Because humanity's goal was not simply to survive the first onslaught, but to shift the balance of power so decisively that the Council would be forced to reconsider its entire approach. And across human space, that message was echoed by political leaders who addressed their populations with calm resolve, explaining that the war would be long, that sacrifices would be required, but that surrender was not an option, and in cities and colonies millions volunteered for service. Industries retooled, and research facilities accelerated projects that had once been considered too ambitious or too dangerous, driven by the knowledge that the fate of their species was being decided among the stars. And in the midst of this mobilization, Captain Daniel Carter led the Resolute and its strike group on a deep penetration mission into enemy territory, tasked with disrupting a staging area where a second massive wave of Council forces was assembling, and the journey itself tested the limits of human navigation, passing through regions of space distorted by ancient stellar remnants. But the crew had trained for such conditions, and when they arrived, they found a sprawling complex of docks and defense platforms, guarded by fleets that outnumbered them many times over. Yet Carter did not hesitate, ordering a coordinated assault that combined electronic warfare, decoy drones, and precision strikes, overwhelming the defender sensors and creating the illusion of a much larger attacking force. And in the confusion that followed, human bombers slipped through and delivered payloads that tore through fuel reserves and reactor cores, igniting chain reactions that consumed the facility. And as the strike group withdrew under fire, they transmitted proof of destruction back to command, a message that rippled through human networks as a symbol that the Council's rear areas were no longer safe. And back in the Council chamber, the tone of the debates shifted from confident planning to urgent crisis management, as representatives demanded to know how supposedly contained species was able to project power so far and so effectively, and some began to argue for opening negotiations, warning that continued escalation might provoke a level response they could not control. But hardliners insisted that the solution was to commit even more force to crush humanity with sheer numbers, believing that the losses so far were acceptable in the pursuit of maintaining galactic order. And so the orders went out for grand convergence, the gathering of the largest armada the Council had assembled in centuries, a force meant to advance on Sol and end the war in a single overwhelming blow, unaware that humanity had anticipated such a move and was preparing a defense that went far beyond static fortifications, involving mobile fleets, layered missile barges, and experimental systems that had never before been tested in open battle. And as both sides raced toward what they believed would be the decisive confrontation, the understanding slowly spread among alien officers and politicians alike that this was no longer a simple punitive expedition. It was a full-scale war against a civilization that refused to yield, that learned from every encounter, and that was revealing, piece by piece, a depth of strategic thought and technological innovation that the galaxy had never expected. And with each passing day, the realization grew, more uncomfortable, that in trying to erase humanity, the Council had not only failed to intimidate them, it had forged them into a unified, determined force whose response was reshaping the balance of power, and that the coming battles would decide not just the fate of one world or one species, but the future order of the entire galaxy. As the Grand Armada of the Council gathered and began its slow, inexorable advance toward the Sol system, its commanders confident that sheer mass and firepower would finally break the human resistance, a parallel effort unfolded in the shadows, because while the alien fleets moved in visible strength, humanity's strategists had already shifted to a deeper layer of the conflict, one that focused not only on ships and weapons, but on information, perception, and the political cohesion of the enemy alliance itself. And in secure rooms beneath Earth and aboard mobile command ships, analysts studied intercepted transmissions and diplomatic channels, mapping fault lines between the Council's member powers, identifying old rivalries, economic dependencies, and cultural tensions that had been suppressed under the banner unity, but never truly resolved. And they saw an opportunity to widen those cracks, to apply pressure in ways that would force the Council to question whether its coalition could endure a prolonged, costly war. And so carefully crafted intelligence leaks began to appear, revealing the disproportionate losses suffered by certain species, exposing how some fleets were being used as expendable vanguards while others held back. And as these truths circulated, resentment simmered and trust eroded, because even among ancient empires, pride and self-preservation could not be ignored. And while diplomats publicly reaffirmed their commitment to the campaign, privately some leaders began to wonder whether the price of erasing humanity might be higher than the benefits. And in the midst of this political tension, the first elements of the Grand Armada reached the outer defenses of the Sol system, where they encountered a wall of layer resistance unlike anything they'd faced before. Not a single line of battle, but a shifting, adaptive network of minefields, autonomous platforms, and mobile squadrons that struck and withdrew, drawing the attackers deeper while constantly feeding targeting data to human command. And the initial clashes were brutal, with entire formations shredded by coordinated missile storms that exploited minute vulnerabilities in shield cycling and with electronic countermeasures that blinded sensors at critical moments, causing collisions and friendly fire among tightly packed alien vessels. And as losses mounted, the invading commanders pressed on, driven by orders and by the belief that overwhelming numbers would eventually carry the day. Yet the deeper they advanced, the more complex and dangerous the battle space became, with gravitational anomalies and asteroid clusters used by human pilots as cover and as weapons, guiding enemy ships in the trajectories they could not escape. And in one such engagement, a massive carrier of the Zoran Collective was lured into a narrow corridor between two dense asteroid fields, where human strike craft, flying with reckless precision, disabled its maneuvering thrusters, leaving it adrift and vulnerable. And as its escorts attempted to regroup, long-range kinetic weapons fired from concealed platforms punched through their hulls, and the carrier itself was eventually destroyed in a controlled detonation that lit the void and sent debris cascading to the surrounding formation, a loss that sent shockwaves to the Coalition and forced a temporary halt in the advance. While back on Earth, the news was received with a mixture of grim satisfaction and sober awareness that the enemy still possessed vast reserves, and that the true test lay ahead. And at the political level, Ambassador Hale and his team continued to work the diplomatic front, opening channels with neutral and minor powers, presenting evidence of the Council's aggression and of humanity's restraint in targeting only military assets. And slowly, cautiously, some began to shift their stance, offering quiet support, intelligence, or access to infrastructure, not out of altruism, but out of a growing sense that aligning with a determined, capable humanity might be wiser than remaining bound to a council that had misjudged the situation so badly. And within the council chamber itself, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained as casualty reports and logistical failures piled up, and the once confident projections of a swift victory were replaced by uncertain estimates and emergency requests for reinforcements. And though the official line remained that the campaign was proceeding as planned, the reality was that the invasion had stalled, bleeding resources and morale, while the humans showed no sign of weakening, and in fact were beginning to push outward, launching probing attacks against staging areas and supply routes even as they held their defensive lines. And for the first time since the vote to erase humanity, the possibility was openly discussed among some counselors that the decision might have been a grave error, that instead of containing a minor power, they had ignited a war with a species that combined technological ingenuity, strategic patience, and a fierce collective will. And that the longer the conflict continued, the more that will seem to grow, fed by every loss and every threat. And as the great fleets hovered at the edge of human space, regrouping and preparing for what they hoped would be a renewed, decisive push, a quiet, unsettling understanding began to take hold across the galaxy, that the outcome of this war would not be determined by tradition or by the age of empires, but by adaptability and resolve. And in those qualities, humanity was proving to be far stronger than anyone had ever imagined. As a temporary lull settled over front lines near Seoul, both sides used a pause to reassess, refit, and prepare for the next phase. But the contrast in their approaches revealed a deeper difference in how they understood war. Because while the Council's commanders focused on restoring formation integrity and concentrating remaining strength for another massive push, human leadership treated the pause as an opportunity to reshape the entire strategic environment, expanding operations beyond the immediate battlefield and turning the conflict into a multidimensional struggle that stretched the enemy's attention and resources. And in secure conference rooms and aboard mobile flagships, senior officers and civilian leaders reviewed projections that extended months and even years into the future, not with optimism but with cold acceptance that the war would be long and that victory would come not from a single crushing blow, but from sustained pressure applied in ways the Council could not easily counter. And one of the first decisions was to escalate deep strike operations, not only against military targets, but against the industrial and political centers that sustained the Coalition's war effort, carefully selecting objectives whose loss would create internal instability without causing unnecessary civilian casualties. Because humanity understood that the legitimacy of the Council's authority rested on the perception that it provided security and order, and by exposing its inability to protect its own core systems, they could weaken that legitimacy from within. And so task forces were assembled, composed of fast, heavily automated ships designed for long-range operations, supported by stealth platforms and cyber warfare units. And these groups began to slip through gaps in the Coalition's sensor nets, exploiting routes that had been charted by human explorers decades earlier and largely ignored by alien navies. And in the weeks that followed, a series of sudden, precisely timed strikes rippled through Council space, knocking out shipyards, disrupting communication hubs, and temporarily disabling the financial and logistical networks that coordinated fleet movements. And each strike was accompanied by carefully released information that made clear who was responsible and why, emphasizing that these actions were a direct response to the vote to erase humanity and would continue until that policy was reversed. And the effect was profound, because for the first time in centuries, worlds that had considered themselves far from any front line felt the direct impact of war, and their leaders began to question the wisdom of a campaign that had brought such danger to their own systems. And at the same time, on the military front, humanity introduced new defensive measures in Seoul, deploying adaptive shield grids and mobile artillery platforms that could reposition themselves in response to real-time threat analysis, making it increasingly difficult for the invading fleets to find and exploit weak points. And when the Council finally ordered a renewed advance, hoping to regain momentum and restore confidence, they found that the battle space had become even more hostile, with human forces anticipating their vectors and timing and responding with layered, coordinated fire that broke up formations before they could concentrate their strength. And in one particularly costly engagement, a coalition spear had attempted a high-speed penetration toward Earth's inner defenses, only to be met by a combination of long-range kinetic strikes and close-range interceptors that targeted command ships and sensor arrays, leaving the remaining vessels disorganized and vulnerable. And as they tried to withdraw, they were harried by fast attack craft that inflicted further losses, turning what was meant to be a demonstration of power into another painful reminder that the humans were not only holding but steadily improving their ability to counter every tactic thrown at them. And in the Council chamber, these setbacks fueled heated debates, with some representatives demanding even greater commitment resources, and others arguing that the campaign was draining their empires in ways that could not be sustained. And behind closed doors, discussions of political fallout and potential uprisings began to surface because the populations of several member worlds were growing restless under the strain of extended mobilization and economic disruption, and rumors spread that the Council had underestimated the enemy and misled its own citizens. And while official propaganda continued to portray the war as a necessary measure to maintain galactic stability, the cracks in that narrative were becoming harder to conceal, and within human society, the war also left its mark, with casualty lists and images of damaged colonies circulating despite efforts to maintain morale. Yet rather than weakening resolve, these losses seemed to deepen a shared determination, reinforcing the belief that survival required unity and persistence, and that the galaxy had to be shown, beyond any doubt, that humanity could not be coerced or erased. And as Admiral Bennett addressed her staff after another day of heavy fighting, she reminded them that the enemy still possessed immense power and that complacency would be fatal. But she also pointed out that the strategic balance was shifting, that the Council was being forced to react rather than dictate, and that every successful defense and every effective strike was teaching the galaxy a lesson it would not soon forget. And as the fleets prepared for the next round of engagements, and diplomats quietly explored channels that might one day lead to a different kind of resolution, the war entered a new phase, one in which the initial arrogance of the Council had been replaced by uncertainty, and in which humanity, once dismissed as a minor and troublesome species, was now recognized, even by its enemies, as a determined and capable power whose fate would shape the future of the galaxy. The growing strain within the coalition began to manifest in subtle but telling ways as the war dragged on, because the unity that seemed so solid when the vote to erase humanity was first passed was now being tested by mounting losses, disrupted trade, and the unsettling realization that the enemy was not weakening but adapting. And in the councils of individual empires, military leaders and economic ministers argued over priorities, some insisting that more ships and crews be committed to finally crush the humans, others warning that their own borders and internal stability were being neglected, and that rival powers not involved in the war might take advantage of the situation. And this tension filtered down to fleets, where captains and admirals received conflicting directives. One moment urged to press the attack aggressively, the next told to conserve forces and protect vital routes. And this lack of clear, unified purpose began to erode operational cohesion, creating gaps and delays that human intelligence quickly identified and exploited. And in Seoul, Admiral Bennett authorized a series of probing offensives designed not to seize territory, but to test reactions, sending small but highly capable task groups into contested zones to observe how quickly and effectively the coalition could respond. And the results confirmed what analysts had suspected, that response times were lengthening, coordination between different species fleets was becoming strained, and command hierarchies were showing signs of confusion. And with this information, human planners refined their strategy, shifting from primarily defensive operations to a more balanced approach that combined protection of core systems with selective, high-impact strikes aimed at further destabilizing the enemy's war effort. And one such operation targeted a major communications relay that linked several coalition sectors, a hub whose destruction or capture would not only disrupt military coordination but also symbolically demonstrate that no part of Council space was beyond reach. And the mission was entrusted to a composite force under the command of Captain Carter, whose previous successes had earned him both respect and the burden of increasingly difficult assignments. And as the ship slipped through layers of detection and approached the relay, they encountered stiff resistance from patrol groups that had been reinforced in response to earlier raids. Yet through a combination of feints, electronic deception, and precise timing, the human force managed to isolate the hub, disabling its defenses and forcing its operators to abandon it. And rather than simply destroying the structure, Carter ordered its data cores extracted and transmitted to intelligence, a trove of information that revealed not only fleet movements, but internal council communications, debates, and contingency plans. And the analysis of this material provided invaluable insight into the coalition's thinking, confirming the existence of deep divisions and the growing fear among some leaders that the war was spiraling beyond their control. And armed with this knowledge, humanity intensified its diplomatic outreach, quietly contacting those factions most disillusioned with the campaign, offering assurances that the conflict need not continue if the policy of extermination was abandoned. And while no formal agreements were reached, the very fact that such conversations were taking place further undermined the sense of absolute unity the Council had tried to project. And on the battlefield, the human military continued to refine its methods, integrating lessons from each engagement into updated doctrines and training, so that new crews arriving at the front were already versed in countering the tactics that had cost earlier units their lives. And this rapid learning cycle, driven by advanced simulation and a culture that encouraged initiative and honest assessment of mistakes, gave human forces an edge that their opponents, bound by more rigid traditions and slower bureaucratic processes, struggled to match. And as months passed, the cumulative effect of these factors became evident in the shifting balance of power, with coalition advances slowing to a crawl and human counteractions growing bolder and more frequent. And in the council chamber, where once the fate of Earth had been decided with casual certainty, the mood grew heavy and contentious as representatives faced the uncomfortable truth that their vote had not only failed to intimidate humanity, but had drawn them into a conflict that was reshaping the political and military landscape of the galaxy, and that the species they had sought to erase was now forcing them to confront the limits of their own power and the consequences of their arrogance. As the war entered its later stages, the cumulative pressure exerted by humanity's military, economic, and diplomatic efforts began to produce visible fractures in the Grand Coalition, because the cost of sustaining the campaign was no longer abstract, but measured in lost fleets, disrupted trade routes, and growing unrest on homeworlds that had been promised a swift and decisive victory. And in several council member states, legislative bodies, and ruling councils demanded explanations from their leaders, questioning why so many resources were being poured into a war that seemed to grow more complex and dangerous with each passing cycle. And these internal debates slowed decision-making and created delays in the flow of reinforcements and supplies to the front, delays that human intelligence quickly detected and incorporated into operational planning. And in response, Admiral Bennett authorized a coordinated series of offensives designed to exploit these weaknesses simultaneously across multiple sectors, forcing the coalition to either disperse its already strained forces or accept the loss of critical assets. And the operations were carried out with a level of synchronization that surprised even seasoned observers, as human fleets struck shipyards in one region, logistics hubs in another, and command centers in a third, all within a narrow time window, overwhelming the enemy's ability to respond effectively and creating the impression of omnipresence. And this perception that human forces could appear anywhere and at any time had a powerful psychological impact, eroding morale among crews and commanders who now felt that no position was truly secure. And in one particularly telling incident, a coalition task force assigned to guard a vital industrial system received orders to redeploy to reinforce the Seoul front, only to have those orders countermanded hours later due to an unexpected human strike elsewhere. And this constant shifting of priorities led to confusion and fatigue, further weakening the coherence of the overall strategy. And within the human command structure, these developments were studied carefully, not with triumph, but with a sober understanding that the enemy, though strained, was still formidable, and that desperation could drive risky and potentially catastrophic actions. And so preparations were made for the possibility that the Council might attempt a final, all-or-nothing offensive, committing the bulk of its remaining strength in the hope of forcing a resolution. And contingency plans were updated to account for scenarios involving massive fleet concentrations, unconventional weapons, and even attempts to target civilian populations to break human resolve. And alongside these military preparations, political leaders intensified their efforts to shape the post-war environment, drafting proposals for a new framework of interstellar relations that would limit the ability of any single council or empire to unilaterally declare the extermination of a species. And though such ideas were still tentative and met with skepticism, they reflected a growing confidence that humanity would survive the current crisis and would have a voice in determining the future order of the galaxy. And in the council chamber itself, the debates grew more urgent and less restrained, with accusations of mismanagement and reckless escalation traded openly, and some representatives, particularly from worlds that had suffered heavily from human strikes, argued that continuing the war was no longer tenable and that a negotiated settlement should be sought, while others, driven by pride and fear of losing face, insisted that withdrawal or compromise would signal weakness and invite challenges to their authority from rivals both within and outside the coalition. And this clash of perspectives paralyzed decisive action at a time when clarity was desperately needed. And as the political stalemate deepened, reports arrived that a massive concentration of coalition forces was assembling at a distant staging area, far larger than any previous formation, suggesting that the hardliners had prevailed, at least temporarily, and were prepared to launch the long-anticipated final push toward Seoul. And the news was received by human commanders with grim resolve, because they understood that the coming confrontation would likely be the largest and most destructive of the entire war, and that its outcome would determine not only whether humanity could secure its survival, but whether the Council's authority would be irreparably broken. And as fleets on both sides maneuvered into position and the galaxy held its breath, the realization spread, even among those who had once voted so confidently to erase a young species, that they were standing on the brink of a reckoning they had neither fully foreseen nor truly understood. As intelligence confirmed the scale of the coalition's final concentration of forces, the human leadership accepted that the moment they had long prepared for was approaching, the moment when deterrence, delay, and gradual erosion would give way to a direct contest of wills and capabilities on a scale the galaxy had not witnessed in recorded history. And in command centers of Earth and its allied colonies, the atmosphere was tense but controlled, because every officer and analyst understood that the plans now being finalized were the product of years of foresight, simulations, and contingency thinking, and that the coming battle would test not only technology and numbers, but the very principles by which their civilization had chosen to defend itself. And Admiral Bennett addressed the senior commanders through a secure network, reminding them that the objective was not merely to survive the enemy's onslaught, but to demonstrate, so clearly and so decisively that no doubt could remain, that humanity could not be threatened with extinction and expect a yield, and that the response to such a threat would be overwhelming and unforgettable. And across the fleets, crews prepared their ships with quiet intensity, performing checks, loading munitions, and reviewing battle plans that coordinated thousands of vessels across multiple layers of space, from the outer reaches of the heliosphere to the deep gravity wells near the inner planets. And among them were veterans of the early clashes, who had seen alien arrogance turn to shock, and new recruits who had grown up during the war and now stood ready to defend a species whose unity had been forged by the Council's own decision. And as the coalition armada finally began its advance, a vast and glittering tide of metal and energy, its commanders confident that their concentrated power would sweep aside the remaining resistance, They encountered the first layer of humanity's final defense, a dispersed but highly interconnected screen of sensors and autonomous platforms that fed targeting data to command in real time, allowing human forces to track the enemy's movements with unprecedented clarity. And as the Armada pressed inward, it was met by long-range strikes that targeted key nodes within its formation, not seeking immediate destruction but disruption, breaking coordination, and forcing local commanders to react independently. And this fragmentation was then exploited by human mobile groups that darted in and out, delivering precise blows and withdrawing before they could be enveloped. And the battle unfolded not as a single clash, but as a series of interlocking engagements, each carefully timed and positioned to draw the enemy deeper into a web of overlapping fields of fire and electronic warfare. And at the heart of this web lay systems that had been held in reserve until this moment, experimental technologies that combined advanced propulsion, energy manipulation, and artificial intelligence to create weapons and defenses capable of operating at speeds and with levels of coordination that far exceeded anything the coalition had anticipated. And when these systems were activated, the effect was immediate and dramatic, as human ships maneuvered with an agility that defied conventional expectations, and their strikes arrived with precision that overwhelmed even the most sophisticated countermeasures. And the coalition's numerical advantage began to erode as formations were cut apart, command vessels were isolated, and supply lines were severed in the midst of battle. And the psychological impact was as significant as the physical losses, because the enemy's leaders could now see, in stark detail, that humanity had not only prepared for this confrontation, but had designed its entire strategic posture around the assumption that one day such a moment would come, and that the Council's attempt to impose its will through fear and force had instead triggered the release of capabilities that might otherwise have remained hidden for decades. And as the fighting intensified and casualty reports climbed, voices within the coalition command structure began to call for reassessment, and even withdrawal, warning that the cost of continuing was spiraling beyond any rational calculation. But the momentum of the engagement and the weight of prior commitments made it increasingly difficult to change course, and so the Armada pressed on, even as its losses mounted, and its cohesion frayed, driven by a mixture of duty, pride, and the fading hope that a breakthrough might still be possible. And on the human side, the resolve hardened with every successful defense and counterstrike, as commanders and crews alike understood that they were not merely defending their home system, but shaping the future of interstellar relations, and that the outcome of this battle would send a message that would echo far beyond the immediate participants. And as the two forces collided in the inner reaches of the Sol system, the scale and intensity of the conflict reached a level that left no room for illusion, making it clear to all who observed, whether from distant listening posts or from the council chamber itself, that the era of casual domination and unquestioned authority was coming to an end, and that the species once dismissed as a minor and inconvenient presence was now standing at the center of a struggle that would redefine the balance of power in the galaxy. As the final engagements unfolded across the Sol system, the full scale of humanity's preparedness became undeniable, because every layer of defense, every hidden fleet, every contingency plan, and every strategic innovation was brought to bear in perfect coordination, and the invading Armada, vast and confident, found itself fragmented, its command networks disrupted, its formations shattered, and its numerical advantage reduced to a meaningless figure against the combination of human ingenuity, adaptability, and unyielding resolve. And as the coalition commanders struggled to regain control, human strike groups exploited every weakness, targeting command vessels, supply convoys, and critical infrastructure with precision and speed that seemed almost prescient, while autonomous systems and AI-assisted weapons delivered strikes that amplified human efforts, ensuring that no element of the Armada could act independently without exposing itself to devastating countermeasures. And the battle rapidly became a demonstration of not just military skill, but strategic foresight, as humans anticipated moves before they were made, turning assumptions of enemy superiority into traps and ambushes, forcing the coalition to react constantly rather than execute its own plans. And as losses mounted, panic began to spread among crews and officers, with some species fleets attempting to retreat, only to find their escape routes blocked by human squadrons and automated interdiction networks. And in the council chambers far from the front lines, the arrogance and certainty that had led the vote to erase humanity was replaced by disbelief fear, and recrimination, as reports of catastrophic losses, captured intelligence, and unprecedented human tactics circulated, revealing that the species they had dismissed had not only survived their initial attacks, but had mastered the art of war against far older and supposedly more advanced civilizations. And as the Council debated, futilely, the humans launched their final series of coordinated offensives, striking simultaneously at multiple critical nodes deep within coalition space, crippling fleet coordination, supply lines, and morale, and leaving the remaining armada incapable of sustaining any organized assault. And in those moments, the scale of the human response became evident. A civilization that had been underestimated, ridiculed, and condemned now stood triumphant, not through luck or brute force alone, but through preparation, ingenuity, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to survive and prevail. And as the last pockets of resistance were neutralized, the message was unmistakable, carried across the void in both the debris of shattered fleets and the reports transmitted back to Council worlds. The vote to erase humanity had been a catastrophic miscalculation, one that had awakened a power far greater than anyone had anticipated, and that species was now fully aware of its own strength and ready to assert it. And in the quiet aftermath, as human ships regrouped, repaired, and resupplied, the leaders of the Council could only reckon with the consequences of their decision, realizing that their arrogance had not only failed to extinguish a young civilization, but had empowered it to shape the destiny of the galaxy, and humanity, having demonstrated its superiority in the theater of war and the mastery of strategy, stood unbowed, its unity and resilience a testament to the folly of underestimating a species capable of turning the very act of attempted annihilation into the crucible that forged its legend. And as the surviving Council members observed the scope of their losses and the rising presence of human fleets across critical sectors, the realization dawned fully that the vote to erase humanity had, in effect, signed the death warrant not of Earth alone, but of the complacent arrogance that had long dominated interstellar politics, and the galaxy would never again view humans as insignificant. For the species that had been dismissed as weak had proven, decisively and irrevocably, that it would endure, adapt, and, when threatened, rise to a level of power and influence that no council, no empire, and no fleet could ignore.